Sorry, everyone. Julia's computer just froze. I'm gonna wait until that's back up so that we can record a roll call. Before we get started, the Dalhousie Student Union acknowledges that Dalhousie University and the Dalhousie Student Union building are located on traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. The Dalhousie Student Union seeks to honor the relational treaty process in its programming, events, and meetings. We'll begin with the roll call. Amina.
Present.
Masuma.
Present.
Chantel.
Present.
Corey.
Present.
Alex.
Present.
Jeremy.
Present.
Katie George Jim.
Here.
Ali Barney. Mary McDonald. Katie Douglas. Katie Douglas let me know that she would be late. Ashley Farrell.
Here.
Kate Rumbold. Yazin.
Here.
Reese McDonald.
Present.
Chad let me know he wouldn't be here. Katie McClellan.
Here.
Chelsea Cox.
Here.
Arizu Hosseini.
Here.
And Cameron Findlay let me know that she wouldn't be here.
Doesn't understand.
Okay, let's move along to the adoption of the agenda. Do I have a mover and a seconder for adopting the agenda? Seconder Jeremy, second Amina. Okay, there are.
I think there's just a spelling mistake.
Okay, sure. So if you have, are there any amendments to the agenda? I have a couple, but is there a spelling mistake somewhere?
It's just in mine.
Right. Okay, we can amend it. Other amendments, we have a couple of appointments that need to be added for council members. We need a council member to sit on the accessibility bursary committee. We need a councillor to sit on the budget and finance committee, and we need a councillor to sit on the student life committee. As well as required in bylaws, we need to have a discussion at this council meeting about the elections timeline. So with councillors' approval, we will add a section under new business. It would be section D, discussing the timeline for the elections next spring, the DSU elections. Are there any other amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, is there any opposition to the amendment of the agenda as I've described? Seeing none, that's taken on unanimous consent. Just give me a second to add these. Minutes of the previous meeting. Do I have a mover and a seconder for the minutes of the September, to accept the minutes of the September 27th council meeting? I have one amendment to those that has been submitted. Mover and a seconder for that. Corey, second. Anybody? Ashley? The only amendment was that in the minutes, notice of motion wasn't included for the ethical investment policy. Are there any other amendments to the minutes? This is the September 27th meeting. Okay, so we'll vote first on amending the agenda, amending the minutes. Do I have a mover and a seconder to amend the minutes? As I mentioned, Suma, Corey, any opposition to this? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. Passing the minutes of the September 27th, 2017 meeting. Are there any other amendments to these minutes? Anything that was missed? Seeing none, is there any opposition to approving the minutes of the September 27th, 2017 meeting? Seeing none, that's taken on unanimous consent. Moving along to the minutes of the October 11th special council meeting. Do I have a mover and a seconder to accept the minutes of the October 11th council meeting? Mover, seconder, somebody. Corey. Masuma. Thank you. Only one amendment has been submitted. The date on the top was incorrect. It was actually the 11th. Mover and seconder. Are there any other amendments to those minutes? All right, mover seconder for that one amendment then. Katie McClellan. Anybody else? Reese. Wonderful. Is there any opposition to that amendment? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. Is there any opposition to accepting the minutes of the October 11th, 2017 council meeting? Seeing none, that's taken on unanimous consent. I'll move along to communications received. I received notice from Chad and Cameron that they would not be here, and also from Katie Douglas letting me know that she would be late. That's it. Move along to appointments. First, the Elections Review Committee LGBTQ2+ representative. This is the Elections Review Committee that was struck at a March meeting of, an April meeting of council to examine the Dalhousie Student Union elections process. Are there any nominees for the LGBTQ2+ representative on the Elections Review Committee? For the second time, are there any nominations for this position? For the third and final time, are there any nominations for this position? All right, nominations are closed. There were no nominations, so this will come up at the next council meeting. Moving along to the Accessibility Fund Committee. We need one council member to be appointed to this committee. Alex, did you want to talk a little bit about what this committee does?
Sure. So yeah, it's kind of confusing, but there's like a university committee that grants money, and then the DSU has a separate committee which grants money. And this money comes from an accessibility levy that was passed in 1996, I think. So it's a levy that we get every year from students, and part of that is meant to go towards a bursary for students with accessibility needs. Right now we're kind of in the process of like developing better guidelines for how to give out that money, because it's been pretty like loose and hasn't had a really solid framework for the past several years. So we're probably gonna like really start processing next month, but right now we're meeting more to develop guidelines. And then, yeah, you just go through applications for bursaries, and it obviously is like confidential information. So yeah, it's a pretty chill committee. I need a counselor on it.
Are there any nominations for counselor on the Accessibility Fund Committee? Counselors can self-nominate. Are there any nominations for counselor on the Accessibility Fund Committee?
Reminder that every counselor has to sit on at least one committee.
Yep.
That is true. For the third time, are there any nominees for council member on the Accessibility Fund Committee? All right, nominations are closed. We'll let councillors think about that one a little bit. I encourage you all to sit on this committee. I have sat on it before. It is a good committee, but that will come up at the next council meeting. I suppose I should have said that before I asked you to volunteer, in hindsight. Second, the Budget and Finance Committee. Chantal, do you want to talk a little bit about what that committee does?
Yes, I can speak to it. We're looking for one counselor to fill the position on this committee. So this committee oversees the finances of the union and approves all large expenditures that have not been budgeted for over the amount of $10,000, I believe. You also have the opportunity to review the budget revisions before the City Council, as well as the overall budget. We meet bi-weekly and just determine or just oversee the overall financial health of the committee. Yeah. I would really prefer not to have my photo taken, sir. Thank you.
All right. Are there any nominations for member of the Budget and Finance Committee? This is a counselor, a non-executive counselor. Are there any nominations for council member on the Budget and Finance Committee?
I'll nominate.
Reese, do you want to nominate yourself?
Yes.
Perfect. Are there any nominations for council member on the Budget and Finance Committee for the third and final time? Right, seeing none, the nominations are closed. Where there is only one person who applied for this, do I have a mover and a seconder to appoint Reese McDonald, council member on the Budget and Finance Committee? Mover, seconder, Alex and Chantal. Is there any opposition to Reese's appointments? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. Moving along to the Student Life Committee. Again, we need one counselor to sit on this committee. Corey, did you want to speak a little bit about what this committee does?
Sure. So the Student Life Committee I chair it. It plans out and facilitates all of the events, programming, and such that we do with the union. We planned out the pumpkin carving event that we did. We're planning Snow Week right now, which happens in January. It's a fun committee. It's pretty chill. We meet once about every 2 weeks for about an hour. I just need one counselor to sit on it, but it is an open committee, so as many counselors as they would like can sit on it.
Perfect. Are there any nominations for council member on the Student Life Committee?
I nominate Chelsea Cox.
Wonderful. Chelsea, do you accept the nomination?
I do.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations for council member on the Student Life Committee? For the third and final time, are there any nominations for council member on the Student Life Committee? Nominations are closed. Do I have a mover and a seconder to appoint Chelsea Cox to the Student Life Committee? Moved by Katie McClellan, seconded by Corey. Is there any opposition to Chelsea's appointment? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. We do not have any presentations. Committee reports. Amina, do you want to talk about what the board caucus has been up to?
Sure. So we had a board meeting on
October 17th.
October 17th, where I had a presentation or gave a quick overview, and that document that was a part of the package was presented to council, along with an update on the DSU and updates from the DSU blog reps, which they will speak to. Yeah, if folks have questions about the document that was circulated, I'm happy to answer them. I would say it was fairly well received. We didn't receive many questions or feedback at the time, but I think there was a commitment to passing them on to chairs of committees that can dive down into the specific asks. And so, yeah, that was good to see. Do you guys feel it forward?
In addition to that, I guess I'll just update you on some of the committee work that I've been involved with on the Capital Projects Committee. Right now, this just passed in the board. It has to do with then updates to our banner software. So that's been a lot of what the committee work has been about. I met with Ian Nason, he's the Vice President of Finance at the university, on someday earlier this week for about an hour, and he just gave me a full rundown on how the university goes about building buildings and everything that one needs to know about capital projects and finance, which was really useful. So if anybody has any questions about that, I might be in a slightly better position to answer them. Also, in our upcoming board retreat, I think it was the Governance and Human Resources Committee, but it's hard to know if the students aren't on that one, who have committed to doing a blanket exercise at the retreat. I think that was happening anyways, but they put it at a different time to make it more accessible. So that's also happening. We have our board retreat at the end of November, so plenty of updates to come after that. Anything I missed?
This would be the time if you have any questions or wanted clarification on anything. Feel free to ask us.
Questions or all right. We'll move along then to Senate caucus. Ms. Uma, what's going on with the Senate?
So, last Monday, the Senate passed that we will be receiving 4 student seats on Senate. So the Senate gave us a yes. We're still waiting for the board to pass it, but I believe that there should be no problems in passing it on the board level. So we're gonna have 4 more student seats by January. So I'd say that that's a huge success, considering we're going up by 2% in terms of representation at Senate. So we're going from 9 to 11%, and we're and the administration has gone down by 1%, and the faculty has gone down by 1%. So we're gaining. So it's been good. I don't know if you want to talk about the so the Senate caucus itself has been meeting the Sundays before Senate to deconstruct the package that's there, and making sure that we're on top of the the information that comes up on Senate. We're also looking into making sure that the Senate caucus is structured in a way that's beneficial. There's not a lot of structure in place. So now that we have our seats, the Senate caucus is focusing on the new sexual violence policy that's coming through, as well as solidifying our structure, because currently in the bylaws and policies there's no it's too loose. It's very, very, very loose. So we're gonna work to do some structuring after that, and we'll keep you in the loop. And once we have something drafted with Megan, we will push that forward, and I'll bring it to council, and you folks can talk about it. But I'm gonna push this over to Mina because she also had a president's report at Senate.
So similarly presented to Senate on behalf of the Senate caucus. We're looking at, or we have moved towards a different way of reporting. Previous presidents have really focused on just providing an update of DSU programming and events, which is great, and that will still be happening with the president report. but we really wanted to look at how we can effectively use our voices with the allotted time that we have to bring forward relevant recommendations to both governing bodies. And so for each meeting, each caucus, so the board caucus as well as the Senate caucus, it develops or comes up with a theme that they would like to focus on, and we look at developing recommendations based on that theme, and we present those to the relevant bodies. Likewise, I think it was well received on Senate as well. Yeah, there was a couple questions, but I think were well-intentioned and clarifying questions. So yeah, I think if folks have any thoughts or questions on the new reporting structure, I would love to hear them. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for the Senate caucus?
We got 4 more seats. I mean, it's time to celebrate. We got 4 more seats. So, that wasn't a celebration.
What kind of impact will that have on like the student voting block in the Senate in terms of
11 votes.
11 votes compared to
9. Or no, 7.
7 from
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So percentage-wise, do you think that will like have an impact on like things that pass or don't?
Yeah, I would say so. I think a lot of people abstain in Senate when they're not sure because a lot of people don't actually go through the package. But I think like we will actually have like a very there'll be a lot of momentum in that block, and we are also like these students are going to be able to also sit on the subcommittees of Senate ex officio. And also some are going to be voting members as well. So it's really great to see how we can integrate all those students throughout Senate and have more representation everywhere. So it's great. Cool.
Any other questions for the Senate caucus? All right, we'll move along to a report from the Society Review Committee. Alex?
Society Review Committee is going just great. We had a meeting last week. We'll have one next week. We are at 290 ratified, which is awesome. And we've got like 25 meetings, so we're well on our way to my goal of 365 by the end of the year. And yeah, we also had like I feel like we're getting more kind of issues coming up. Like societies are asking us questions and stuff, so it's interesting to use the committee to like talk about like analyzing their constitutions and stuff instead of just like me making a decision. I'm trying to like get committee's input on how to interpret different societies' constitutions on things. So that's been fun, hasn't it? Yeah. Not much else. It's a steady chugging of ratifying societies.
Anybody have any questions for Alex with the Society Review Committee?
What's the most interesting society you've ratified this year?
Ooh. Oh, there's a magic society that just started. Ooh, that's kind of cool. And a cryptocurrency society.
What?
Oh my god, really?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna make money on the side?
Am I?
No. Are you? No, Alex.
Are there any other questions about any of the hundreds of societies that Alex oversees? Then we'll move along to the Grants and Sponsorship Committee. Chantal, what has the Grants and Sponsorship Committee been up to?
We have been awarding grants. We did miss a week, however, 2 weeks ago, so we'll be making it after a reading week and hopefully meeting twice. We are awarding grants to lots of students going on really rad academic conferences. We will potentially look into like creating deadlines for on a semesterly basis just to like uphold fiscal responsibility, as there is an unfortunate trend of us overspending or just increasing that budget. But we're doing great. We love it. Any questions?
Any questions for Chantal on behalf of the Grants and Sponsorship Committee? Right, we will move along to business. First, the ethical investment policy. Do I have a mover? Yizan has moved the ethical investment policy. Do I have a second? Basuma. Perfect. Then, we haven't done this in a little while, so I'll remind councillors that on any particular issue, they have a grand total of 4 minutes that can be split between any number of speeches, but second speeches aren't recognized until everybody who wants a first speech has had a chance to give that speech. So, Yasmin, as the mover, you have the right to speak first.
I just want to amend the.
You can also move an amendment.
Yeah.
Point of order.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a point of order because the full text of this motion was not given at the last meeting of council.
All right. Yeah, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because this motion or this point of order will take the form of a challenge of the chair. In an email, I ruled that appropriate notice had been given. So the way that this will work is that Reese will have an opportunity to explain why he believes that adequate notice was not given. We did not meet the bylaw requirements. I will have an opportunity to explain why I ruled the way that I did, and then council will have the opportunity to vote on their interpretation of this policy. So Reese, did you want to explain your concerns about this?
I mean, it's pretty clear, 10.2C, it says, notice of any motion to adopt, amend, or repeal any policy, including the full text of the motion, must be given at a meeting of council, and such motion shall not be considered until the subsequent meeting of council. The full text of the motion was not given at the meeting of council. It was emailed out after the meeting was adjourned, not during the meeting. Like it's quite clearly explicitly says must be given at a meeting of council, and it was not. That's it.
All right, thank you, Reese. Here is the explanation that I gave Reese last night. At the council meeting, I, as chair, announced I received one notice of motion from Yazin. It was a rewrite of the ethical investment policy. Less than an hour after this meeting adjourned, the full text of the amended policy was circulated. The draft, and we amended the draft minutes to reflect the fact that notice of motion was given. The spirit of the bylaw is to allow for full consideration of policy changes in consultation with constituents. Councillors have had full access to this policy for 5 weeks. In my opinion, that is plenty of time for full consideration, and I do not believe that that was infringed upon by my neglecting to read the exact text of the motion at the council meeting. I trust that councillors have read this policy and will come to the meeting well prepared. I think that our actions have been fully in line with bylaw requirements, especially if you consider the spirit of the bylaw to allow councillors to consider a policy. So let me explain exactly what you'll be voting on. Reese has motioned to challenge the chair. If you vote for this motion, it will mean that you believe that we should not consider the ethical investment policy because council has not met its bylaw requirements when it comes to notice of motion. If you vote against this motion, then you will be voting for us to consider the ethical investment policy, and you will be interpreting bylaws to mean that we have met our bylaw requirements. Does this make sense to council? You have a question, Jeremy?
No, I'm just thinking.
Okay. Then all in favor of Reese's challenge to the chair?
I'll just point of information that this requires a seconder, right?
You're correct. Is there a second for Reese's challenge to the chair?
Yes.
Mary? All in favor of Reese's challenge? All opposed? The motion fails. Moving along to the consideration of the ethical investment policy. Yazin, I believe you had the floor when that was brought up.
Again, amendment. I want to motion amendment to the be it resolved clause to say at the end, after the word text, to say as amended by the bylaw and policy review committee.
This would be want to take this out?
Not take this out, after the word text, to say as amended by the policy, by the bylaw and policy.
In the last several minutes, I circulated a document to council with the amended text. Yazin, did you want to explain exactly what those amendments
The amendments,
consisted of?
sure. The amendments are just formatting stuff. So if it's nothing substantive, so it mainly has to do with, for example, at one point we mentioned, you know, that the council has, or we have an obligation for the fiduciary duties of the organization, and we just struck that instead the union instead of the organization, just to clarify some things. Some phrasings were sort of obscure, so we just clarified. So there's really nothing substantive. It was mainly formatting changes. So whether you use the copy that was circulated 5 weeks ago, I think, or whether you use the copy that was circulated today, you'll have a pretty solid understanding of the substance. It's really just a couple of words that were changed, and maybe the order of a couple of words in the clause.
Thanks, Yazin. Do I have a seconder for this amendment? Arizu? Arizu, did you want to speak to this amendment at all?
No, but I think it just makes sense. Just what was passed around, I think it clarifies some of the vagueness that were in the clauses, so it definitely does help.
I'll open up the floor to debate on this amendment. It would be amending the motion as follows, and there are formatting changes in the policy itself. Is there any debate on this? Mary?
I just wanted to clarify a couple of points. I know that Yazan is super interested in the ethical investment policy, because I know that you served on the ethical investment policy last year. And the reason I know about that is that you talked to the electronic Intifada about that.
Right.
And you also took some swipes at me.
Sir,
when you talked to the electronic
Mary,
Intifada.
is this related to the motion to amend or the
Well, I just
motion
wanted
to
to
adopt?
clarify, because I just want to make clear that Yazan, you put in the motion, correct? And you voted on the motion at the policy review committee, right? You voted on your own motion. And you also sit on the finance committee, on which you have a vote about the ethical investment policy. And in turn, you're also a member of the subcommittee that was part of the amendment. So those are 4 interlocking sort of spheres of influence. I just wanted to ask you, Yazin, do you have a degree or any training in finance?
Sorry, I'm going to rule that this isn't related to the proposal that Yazin just made to amend the motion. If you would, this would be potentially related to discussion on the amendment as a whole, on the policy as a whole, but I will rule at that if it comes back.
I just thought it was the first question to ask.
This is out of order. Yazin, I will allow you to respond to that if you would like, but then I would like to get back to debate on this amendment.
I'll respond to it when it's time to respond to it. Right now it's not the time to vote.
In that case, is there any other debate on the amendment that Yazin just proposed? Seeing none, is there any opposition to amending the motion to include the words as amended by the Bylaw and Policy Review Committee? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. We will move along to a debate on this Bylaw and Policy Review Committee as a whole. And Yazin, I will allow you to continue using your time that you get as mover to agitate, presumably for this vote.
To answer your questions, Mary, I don't sit on the subcommittee yet because it's not a thing yet. This policy is what's going to create it. I think you're implying that I have a conflict of interest. The conflict of interest is defined as having some sort of financial ties to the motion. I have no financial ties to the motion. If I may finish.
Order.
A third thing you're implying is, or saying, is that I don't have a degree in this, which is, it's true, I don't. But this has been the collaborative work of the policy coordinator, the general manager, the investment manager. I think they have a degree. The VPFO, the president, myself, the bylaw and policy review committee. I think this is a pretty exhaustive list of people who have worked on this. I'm not the only person putting this forward.
No, but the fact
Order.
remains-
Order. The floor is still here.
That's it.
Okay. Sima, did you second this motion?
Yep.
Would you like to speak to it?
Yeah, I think we should all vote in favor of it. We've had 5 weeks to look at it. I've looked at it, and I agree with this motion wholeheartedly. So I would request or ask folks to vote in favor of this motion. I think it will do amazing things for our union, and I think we should be prioritizing this work.
Other speakers for this motion? Do we have anybody who would like to speak against this motion? Mary?
Well, first, I would maintain that adequate notice was not provided despite the ruling. And, to speak to my question to Yason as to whether he has a business degree or background or finance background. The reason why I asked that was not to, belittle him in any way. It's because any person who does have a degree in finance or in business would recognize that that is undue influence for a person to be sitting on 4 interlocking and interrelated committees. That was the
I don't
point
think
I
this
was
is
trying to make.
something that Suzanne, I think, is being not directed through the chair, and I'm not comfortable with this conversation.
I tend to agree. I think that we should focus on the ethical investment policy as it has been proposed. We are not here to debate the involvement of Yazin in this process as he has laid out. There were many voices. If you would like to vote against it, then I would encourage councillors to vote against it on the merits of the policy. Mary, did you have anything else that you'd like to say in your time?
No, just to reiterate that anyone who's familiar with business processes would recognize that that is a matter of undue influence. A person is voting on their own amendment and voting, there's 4 interlocking spheres of influence there.
Okay, do I have anybody who would like to motivate for this motion? Sorry, I have Chantal on the speakers list. Next.
I would just like to clarify the amendment of this policy. It is not a politically driven policy. It is to just report on the investments of the union. It is clarified that it is a subcommittee budget and finance, so those doing so have an oversight of the fiscal health of the union. They do not have the authority to pull out or choose to invest into things. However, they are reporting to council. They can make suggestions, and if those decisions are made, they still must go through our general manager, all 3 signing authorities, and it must also be passed at council. So I still think there's quite a bit of a process for anything political to happen if that were the case. But I think the nature of this motion is just to put more, create a greater scope for this committee to report to, and just take into consideration the fiscal health of the union.
Can I respond to Chantal?
Not at this time. If you would like to speak again, I can add you to the speakers list. Once people who haven't spoken at least once have had the time to speak. Is there anybody who would like to motivate against this motion? Anybody would like, I have Amina next on the speakers list, just 4. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to speak as the chair of the Bylaw and Policy Review Committee. This policy has been in front of the committee for quite some time, and it was a unanimous vote of the committee, and I just wanted that to be known to council.
Thank Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to speak on this motion? Yasmin and then Mary?
Well, I just
To be fair, I
wanted
think
to
she
read
was
these
first.
to Sean.
Mary.
Sean Thompson.
Can we move to call the question?
You can move to call the question. It does require a 2/3 vote.
Can I move to call the question?
Sure. Do I have a seconder to call the question? Jeremy. All in favor of calling the question? All opposed? That vote passes. The question is, be it resolved that the ethical investment policy as it stands be replaced with the circulated text as amended by the Bylaw and Policy Review Committee. All in favor of this motion, please raise your hand or otherwise indicate. All opposed? The motion, any abstentions? The motion passes. We will move along to the statement on systemic racism.
Chris, can I call for recess? 5 minutes?
Sure. Alex moves for a 5-minute recess. Do I have a seconder? Katie George Shim. All in favor of a 5-minute recess? All opposed? We are in recess until 6:51. we're back in session. Moving along to under new business, section B, the statement on systemic racism. Just before we get started on this, I wanted to offer a couple of chair's notes on this. I understand that this is likely to be a very emotional discussion for councillors. I certainly have not been insulated from reading the news recently. I require and strongly remind councillors to remain respectful during this debate and to keep the debate about the motion that is before council. The motion as it is stated on the agenda and on the boards right now. We are not here to determine the existence of systemic racism. We are here to debate whether we should release a statement and then draft an issues policy based on that statement. With that out of the way, Amina, I believe that you moved this motion. Do I have a seconder for this motion? Katie George Jim. We will begin debate with Amina.
So I'm very excited to bring this motion forward on behalf of the entire executive. The statement has been circulated, and I do hope that councillors had an opportunity to consult with their constituencies and specifically take direction and listen to those who are impacted by systemic racism. I've personally circulated the statement within my networks to encourage feedback. And I've received overwhelming support from students, faculty, alumni, and community members at large. As Chris said, we're not here to discuss whether or not systemic racism exists. We know that it does, but we're here to talk about whether or not the DSU will take a stance. And we appreciate all opinions on this matter. And I look forward to hearing what councillors have to say.
Next I have Katie George Jim.
Since I guess I mentioned, I obviously should support it, along many other reasons. Kidding. Full weight behind, obviously, of the very powerful words Amina and her executive have crafted about many students, not just two sitting around the table at Dow recently and throughout our entire time. And I think this conversation needs to be steered and narrated by people that hold those experiential problems and trying to heal from that. And I think having a union step behind our marginalized students, even if our university doesn't all the time, I think is very respectful and also following through on a lot of what our policies and statements about equity and inclusion and anti-racism. So I think the statement crafted does a really good job of identifying all of those issues specific to our union, as well as solutions and targets and goals on how we can move forward. So, don't you agree with that?
Thank you, Katie. I'll open up debate on the motion, alternating between for and against. We just heard 2 for. Is there anybody who would like to agitate against this motion?
Can I make a motion, please, to postpone this motion indefinitely, because it...
just a second, you can. Does it have a seconder? Reese, okay. Mary, why did you want to postpone this motion indefinitely?
Why is because I'm concerned that the language tends to impugn members of Dalhousie administration. And we are not finders of fact here.
Point of privilege, sorry. I am
Sure.
in constant communication with the university, along with many other executives around this table, who appreciate and also support many of these statements, if not all made in this statement.
Okay, this point of privilege was out of order. Also, Mary, a agitation to postpone this indefinitely.
I didn't finish though what I was trying to say. I want to.
Sorry, I just wanted to gently remind you that a motion to postpone this indefinitely should mainly be discussed in terms of why the postponing is necessary.
That's what I was trying to say.
Alternatively, you can agitate against this motion. Jen,
Right,
but go ahead.
It's necessary because it impugns members of the Dalhousie administration who should have the right to due process to come to appear before council and respond to the allegations. That's why I'm requesting a motion for indefinite postponement until the individuals are named. I don't know who these individuals are, but this is impugning the administration without hearing from them. And they have the right to due process.
Okay, thank you, Mary. This isn't debatable except as it relates to time. So you can debate about whether we should amend it or postpone it for longer or shorter, but can't debate on the merits. If nobody would like to make any comments on the time that we postpone this, then I would call the question. Be it resolved that this consideration is postponed indefinitely. All in favor? All opposed? The motion failed. Mary, you do have an opportunity to agitate against this motion if you would like.
Yes, I do so respectfully. This document is laden with opinions as opposed to facts. I see this as a deeply flawed document. And I believe that amendments are required because the entire council will be implicated if this motion passes as it reads presently. These are opinions that are outlined in this motion. They are not proven facts. As passionately as some may hold those opinions, they are opinions, not fact.
Thank you, Mary. Would anybody like to motivate for this motion? Corey?
Yeah, so it was quite a long process that we went through to put together this statement on behalf of all the executives. We had a lot of debate around it, but as Chris says, we're not here to debate whether or not systemic racism exists on campus or whether or not the events that led to this stance were in fact racism. We're just here to debate the stance that we're taking, and it clearly outlines that the DSU will not stand for systemic racism on campus, which I think is a pretty valid concern and a pretty valid stance to take on something. Other organizations across the country have released statements that are pretty similar to this one, and I think it's about time that the DSU does as well.
Thank you, Corey. Yasmin, I can add you to the speakers list, but first I would ask if anybody would like to speak against this motion. Seeing none, we can move on to Yasmin. Yasmin?
So our bylaws allow us to have what's called the issues policies. We're allowed to have opinions as a council, we're allowed to have opinions as a union. Those opinions are the result of the democratic process and votes within this council. Just simply pointing out and saying this is an opinion is not enough of an undermining point. Now, if there's a problem with the opinion, you can point it out, we can argue it, but just simply pointing out and say this is an opinion, this is not fact, it's not enough of a reason for me to vote against this. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Yasmin. Would anybody else like to speak on this motion at all? Yeah, I can recognize somebody from the floor. Alex, if you'd like to.
Hi, my name is Alex Foreman. I'm a student at Dalhousie, and I also work for the student union. Can I motivate for this motion? I would like to speak in favor of this motion. I have read the document. I would happily sign my name to this document. I think that it's the right thing to do to call on the university to proceed and to make statements and to sincerely apologize for the harm that they have caused by allowing this media circus for the last few weeks. Dalhousie has not done a sufficient job of controlling the situation in any way. And I absolutely think that you all should vote in favor of this motion. I would like to put my full support behind it.
Thank you, Alex. Would anybody else like to speak to this motion? Are councilors ready for the question? Okay, I can call the question.
I'd like to, excuse me, propose an amendment.
I need to call the question.
Okay, the vote. Give me 2 seconds to check with Roberts about how exactly these two interact.
Good old Bobby.
Okay, councilors. We are in an interesting Robert's Rules situation. A motion to, it's called a motion to call the previous question, does take precedence. However, it takes precedence on the current business in front of council, where Mary did propose a motion first. I am going to allow her to describe that motion, potentially get a second, and then we can proceed to potentially calling the question on her amendment, and then potentially calling the question on the debate as a whole. Does this make sense to everybody? So Mary, you will have an opportunity to state your amendment. Sorry, yeah, first state your amendment.
Okay, the first amendment, I hereby move that paragraph 1 of the letter under consideration be amended as follows. A, insert have claimed they between the words can and are under attack. And B, replace are under attack with face racism, sexism, and discrimination. No.
Is that the substantive portion of this amendment? Would you like to propose all of your amendments as a whole, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So the second amendment. I hereby move that paragraph 1 of the letter under consideration be amended as follows. A, remove is failing us and. There is no consultation with students to determine whether they feel the university is failing them.
You can ask a point of information, sure.
Since this is a letter written by the executive and or a singular executive and is being proposed as a motion to support the letter, not necessarily to deconstruct and change the intention of the letter. I don't know
So
how
you're raising
to
a
move forward.
point, yeah.
I don't know how to move forward with that.
So this would be a point of order.
Because even if it's an amendment to a motion, you can't amend the intention of the motion. And I argue that it's being amended.
Could I also raise a point of order?
Sure.
I believe that they had claimed,
Could you speak?
sorry?
Could you speak?
Oh, sorry. At the beginning of this conversation, Chris, you prefaced with saying that we are not here to talk about or to interrogate the lived experiences of these issues, that we know that they are alive, we know that they're real, and so in my opinion, saying have claimed is doing just that. So I would like to raise that as order.
Could I respond to what I need now?
Sure. Go ahead.
The preamble states that all marginalized people on our campus in a time when our university is failing us. Well, I'm a marginalized student and I do not believe the university is failing us.
Okay. Mary, would you like to continue describing your amendments?
Certainly. So, did you capture amendment 2 that I mentioned?
So far,
Doesn't sound like that's the idea.
that's true. It doesn't address the idea that we are changing the intention of the letter. Thank you for reminding me. I would prefer to have Mary describe her amendment before I make a ruling on whether or not this changes the intention of the letter. However, having said that, I think that I am a poor person to make this ruling, and so I would put it to a council vote on whether the intention has been changed, and so it should be ruled out of order. However, I would prefer to hear Mary's amendment first.
Are we speaking to the preamble? I do apologize for my voice.
It's okay.
I have really bad. Chris, are we speaking to the first paragraph?
Yes, currently things that I have.
It, as it reads, it says all marginalized people on our campus, but all marginalized people on our campus were not consulted, and there is no basis to say that the university is failing all marginalized people on our campus.
Sorry, Mary, what amendment are you proposing? Are you proposing that we, what amendment are you proposing?
Remove is failing us.
Okay, so things that are being proposed that they remove are being bolded and underlined. Things that are proposed to be added are being turned red.
I have a point of information.
Sure, I'll recognize Jad from the floor on a point of information.
What is the responsibility of the Dalhousie Student Union, of the council with respect to passing this motion?
Are they looking to add their name as a signatory? Are they looking for the council to be the people who are proposing this letter? Or is the council looking to support or fail to support the letter? And I think that if it is the latter, which is my impression, I don't think that the council has grounds to alter the words of the people who originally intended to write that. What you can say is you chose not to vote in favor of it, and you hope that another letter will be proposed with that wording changed. But you can't change that and then pass it as your own. That is not in faith with you can't sign in favor of something by changing that wording. You either choose to opt in or opt out. That's the responsibility of council.
Yeah. So my interpretation of the motion is that council is voting on whether to release this statement on behalf of the DSU. Presumably it would be circulated in the way that DSU releases are usually circulated, and also that there will be an issues policy drawn from the statement and presented to council for adoption. So that is what council is voting on, not necessarily putting all councillors' names and signatories on the letter, but rather releasing this letter as a statement of the Dalhousie Student Union. That I understand the concern about amending this letter because it isn't part of the actual motion. Do councillors mind if we take a 5-minute recess while I try and consult some rules and look up whether the letter should be able to be amended, or if that would rather just be an agitation for voting against the motion? That's what I'm going to decide in the 5 minutes that you will hopefully give me. Do I have a mover and a seconder for a 5-minute recess? Chantal and Corey, all in favor, all opposed. We are in a 5-minute recess. Come back at 7:20. So first, I looked at Robert's rules. And based on Robert's rules, I do believe that this amendment, or that this statement is amendable. Having it said that, the amendments that were proposed were quite lengthy. As you can see, anything added in red, this is just the second and third paragraph. We went through the first paragraph in public session. Anything in red is being proposed to be added. Anything that is bold and underlined is being proposed to be taken out. I'm going to give councillors a minute to read this if they want to, instead of me reading it into the records.
Point of order, can you repeat what underline in red means?
Underlined and bolded means take out.
Okay.
In red means added.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I said before, it is in my discretion to ask for council's ruling on whether or not this amendment is germane. So that means if it's not such a huge change to the document, that it would be out of order. So the question that I'm going to ask council is this amendment germane? If you vote yes, that means that you would like to move on to debate about the amendment. If you vote no, then the amendment will be struck down on procedural grounds, and we will move to the consideration of the motion that wasn't amended. The original motion. We do have a standing motion on the floor to call the question. So, once again, if you vote yes, you want a debate to proceed on the amendment. If you vote no, you do not, you believe that the change is so significant that there should be no debate. All in favor of continued debate on this amendment? All opposed? That fails. I rule that this amendment is not germane and so is out of order. It is out of order. With council's position, I can recognize somebody from the floor. However, precedence does go to Katie George Jim's question or calling of the question. So Katie, do you want to yield to let a member from the floor speak? No. Then I have to continue with what is standing on the floor before I can recognize continued debate on this motion. Katie George Jim has motioned to call the question. This requires a 2/3 vote of council. Do I have a seconder on whether or not to call the question? Masuma. All in favor of calling the question? All opposed? Any abstentions? Yes, and abstains. The motion to call the question passes, so I will not be able to recognize anybody from the floor at this point. So the motion that we are voting for on is be it resolved, the DSU will release the following statement. Be it further resolved, the DSU will draft an issues policy drawn from this statement and present it to council for adoption. All in favor of this motion, please raise your hand or otherwise indicate. All opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. Moving along to vacant council seat discussion. I have a document that I prepared for this, and also I believe Alex Lee, the Chief Returning Officer, has submitted a document as well. from a procedural point of view, my explanation seeks to serve as a procedural guide for why council is discussing this. On October 11th, councillors approved a timeline for by-elections to fill empty spots on council. Shortly after that meeting, a councillor pointed out that the decision seemed to contradict a section of the elections policy, specifically section 9.d. In brief, section 9.d states that faculty representative positions that remain unfilled after the elections should be appointed by the nominating committee. It also states that community representative positions are to be appointed by the faculty society's choice of representative. Already within that clause, there are several complicating factors that confuse how we as volunteers and staff of the union are to interpret this. The bylaws do not mention the nominating committee. The relevant section of committee policy is outdated and refers to several functions that the nominating committee serves that contradict bylaws. 9.d.2 mentions that faculty societies are to appoint community seats, and it is unclear how the CRO is meant to determine which faculties elect which communities. The bylaws say the following. I believe it's section 9. C is, should a vacancy arrive in the office of councillor on or before October 31st of the year in which that person was elected, a by-election shall be held to fill such vacancy. As you can see, that clause is able to be interpreted and has been interpreted as only applying to seats that have already been elected where somebody then resigned. It's unclear if it applies to positions that are unelected in the first place. When this was raised, there were conversations between myself, a couple members of the executive, the chief returning officer, policy and governance coordinator, and none of us have the authority to interpret how this policy should be acted on. Council does have the authority, I'll get you right after we finish, to, or unless you have like a point of information or order or privilege.
It's a point of information.
Sure.
So, just to be clear, have the amendments from the last AGM where we passed the new policies, bylaws, been typed up and added to this?
Yes, so my reference to section C here is in the new, the bylaws that are currently in effect, the bylaws that were passed April 2016. That would be the new bylaws.
With amendments from the AGM included?
As far as I know, these are the bylaws that are posted on the website that I reference that are the supreme governing documents of the union. I would assume that the amendments from the AGM were added.
I don't believe, I can bring you evidence that they weren't.
Okay, this is an existential question. I'm going to continue to assume that the governing documents that I have access to are the governing documents of the Dalhousie Student Union. If it's brought to me otherwise, obviously, this conversation will take place in a slightly different context. To get back to it, basically there's a lot of confusion about how we appoint the seats to council, if we elect them, if we appoint them, if we do appoint them, who appoints them, and bylaws and policy haven't provided adequate vacancy. So when staff has a question like this, or volunteers have a question like this, council is the body that ultimately interprets the policies and bylaws of the union. Council has to decide to do one of the following. Either strike a nominating committee, clarify what that committee's role is, and use it to appoint the unelected faculty positions, while also clarifying which societies should appoint community reps as per elections policy 9.d.2. This would be a clarification of why the elections policy does apply in this case. So you would decide that the elections policy applies and also would clarify exactly how we are going to act based on that policy. The other option that you have is to suspend section 9.d of the elections policy temporarily and vote on a different way to appoint vacant seats. There are potentially other options as well. However, you do need to decide whether to continue moving along with elections policy or to suspend elections policy and create a new procedure. The by-election timeline that was approved at the October 11th meeting is no longer feasible. A note on how this discussion is going to take place. This discussion is going to take place. There isn't a motion because staff can't propose a motion. Volunteers can't propose a motion to council. So any motion would need to come from the floor and be voted on from the floor. I recognize that this is a reasonably big ask. It is a reasonably large interpretation that volunteers and staff are asking council to make. And so if councillors are not comfortable making this decision tonight, they do have the opportunity to postpone this discussion to next meeting if they would like. Regardless, the by-election timeline that was approved on October 11th is no longer feasible. What Julia just passed out is a note that came from the Chief Returning Officer confirming that he has put on hold the by-election. Actually, I would recognize Alex if Alex wanted to speak to this document. Alex? You want a copy of it?
I would like to have the council to read my document.
Sir, could you speak up a little bit?
I'll be happy to answer any questions. So basically, regardless how these policies be contradictory to the by-election, it doesn't matter because it's up to the council to decide whether or not we amend the policy to have by-election or how we decide to fill these vacant positions. So I do recommend the council to debate on this matter in next meeting because it does involve how these petitions can be filled, whether or not it's democratic representative to students. The elections committee has opted out to make recommendations, so it is up to the council. However, I do like to point out that there are a few options that I see might be considered. For example, it might not be the best, as historically debated, to have the society and respective committee to appoint petition directly, because that might not necessarily mean that they represent the entire student bodies. But by having a by-election, this can also be done by having a by-election followed by an ad hoc nominee committee to appoint members. And the ad hoc nominee committee can consist of members which is elected by the students. For example, the president of the DSU council, which is elected by, so all of the student members are eligible to vote for. And personally, I don't see how this is not democratic to have the president, for example, to be part of that nominee committee if the council decides it's the best thing to do. And the election will support whatever decision it is that we decide.
Yes, Kate.
I just have a question about having it in a by-election, just because I maybe not be up to date on like where we stand for like how we elect community seats, because there has been a lot of problems with self-identification, and so I would be hesitant to have another full election if we're going to have similar results in that sense. But I am I'm really interested to see how we can better host an election for the process.
So I am currently in the process of working with different mentor schools to find a technical solution on how this can be ensured there's no abuse of procedures. But I didn't want to bring this up because I don't want this to be part of the decision of whether or not we should have a by-election or not to fill these vacancies. But should the council decide to have a by-election, I'll work with my best to find a solution. And if I can ensure that this process is done in a democratic way, that there's not a potential for abuse, then this will be put on hold and we can maybe discuss further about actions.
Are there any other questions for Alex or comments that councillors have to make about moving a motion to interpret this policy, about postponing this until potentially the Vacant Policy Review Committee can discuss it, whatever council would like. There is no motion. Yeah.
Yeah, are there negative implications for any of the timelines if we move to postpone it? Like, I'm hesitant to like move to postpone if like if time is of the essence for this.
The tentative by-election schedule recommendation would call for nominations to open one day before our next meeting of council. So that would be an implication of postponing it.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Any other comments, questions from councilors? Would anybody like to propose a motion?
Chris?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's late in the semester, and I think that if we're gonna go through like a full-on election, I think we should focus that money towards the actual like general election, and we can actually focus on making sure that there's seats for all of these council positions instead of putting some money here and then wasting it, and then the same thing happening. I just don't want this council to continue being empty and those voices not being represented. It's really disheartening to see that. So I think that if we can do something to address this in the short term and focus our attentions on the next election that's coming up, I think that might be more beneficial to us as a union.
Other comments? Katie, go.
I'd like to call a recess for 5 minutes, because I do believe that there was an amendment passed at the AGM
That isn't being reflected.
that isn't being reflected
Okay.
in this motion, and I would like time to look up that evidence.
Sure. Katie calls for a 5-minute recess. Does
Need
this have
5 or
seconds?
10?
Yeah,
It
sorry.
depends on how.
Just
it-
say 10.
Let's
10 is
say,
good.
yeah, we'll say 10.
Okay. I kind of abused it. Katie calls for a 10-minute recess. Do I have a seconder for this motion? Corey, all in favor of a 10-minute recess? All opposed? The motion passes. We are in recess until 8:02.
Yes, I do. I think
30 seconds whenever the executives that are currently at the front are no longer up. We are back in session. Katie Douglas, in the recess, presented information to me that leads me to believe that I haven't presented council a full picture of how this process could run based on our bylaws. The implication that this has is that if council were to make a decision on this tonight, it would potentially be overturned based on changes that haven't been tracked in the bylaws.
Classic DSU.
With that in mind, I would advise council to postpone this discussion until the next meeting so that we can try and bring you as full a picture as possible of what our bylaws actually say. I say this with absolutely no relish.
Just catch up on
It's not funny, guys. Okay, does somebody want a motion to postpone this, or do councilors want to continue discussion? Katie Douglas, you motion to postpone this discussion until the November 15th meeting.
Yes.
Do
You
I have
mean
a second?
November 13th?
November 15th.
15.
It's 2 weeks from today.
The next
Oh,
meeting.
okay.
Yeah, the next meeting. Seconder for postponing. Chantal, wonderful. All in favor of postponing this discussion? All opposed? It is postponed until the next meeting. I'll steal all that. Don't email me before then. It's going to be busy. Next up on the agenda is the spring elections timeline. This is a document that I just like an hour ago circulated to council. Mine is my sent mail. Yes.
Do we know if anything will, like any of those changes will affect this timeline against
It shouldn't affect the timeline. It might affect our elections process, but it shouldn't affect the timeline. If it does, I will let council know.
I think Alex will.
Yeah, just a second, Alex. In Appendix 1 of the elections policy, it says that we have to consider an elections timeline before November 1st. This is why this is being brought to council right now, even though the elections are several months away. Alex, do you want to explain how this timeline was created?
Yeah, so the committee has decided to, so we can work it through and decide to recommend timeline. And I know that we have an issue in terms of like the accuracy of the uploaded bylaw, but if you guys decide to approve this timeline and it somehow violate or contradict the bylaw, it simply wouldn't be valid. We can just do another vote, so it doesn't really matter. And just want you guys to know that although this is a recommendation, but if you guys think it's necessary, you can amend the timeline as you deem necessary. Like, it doesn't have to be from us.
Does anybody have any questions for Alex about this timeline? Alex, and then Katie McClellan, and then Katie Georgetown. And then Rosima.
I just wanted to ask the why 16 calendar days for campaign period?
So the elections committee's opinion is that the longest the campaign period, the better. And we've also discussed some of the things that might be affected by this. For example, the current position, the current holding position, would it affect their job because they might have to take vacation time or they might not be able to perform some function. And I think Megan is working on a new elections policy, which we will discuss next meeting, which allows the current executive members to continue their job without being affected by the campaign. And it's up to them if they decide to campaign or not. And the committee's decision is that they do not believe by having the position currently in the office will gain any advantage for yourself. For example, you go to the and this is also a
Sorry, yes, I have Katie McClellan and Masuma, and then yes.
Yeah, my concern, I guess, with the length of the days, I know, like, running the elections this year, it was quite busy. Like, I have a really heavy course load, and, like, it's a very strenuous period of time. And I'm not sure if extending it, well, it might be good for increasing the turnout for voters. I think it might be a lot for the candidates, and it might discourage people from running.
Right. So my personal view as a CRO is that there's not enough data for me to quantify exact pros and cons of having this list. But it is the committee's recommendation that they believe it's better to have a longer period because many people have reflected their opinion that they didn't get enough time, or it might not be the time matter, that they didn't get enough opportunity to know the candidate placing the campaign. That's what the committee's recommendation was. Yes, but it's ultimately up to the council if you guys would like to modify this list.
Katie McClellan, do you have a follow-up, or did you have
It's a separate thing.
Okay, I'll add you to the end of the speaker. I have Masuma, then Yazin, then Katie George Shim, and then Katie McClellan.
Yeah, I think I'm concerned with the voting period, just because it's so close to exam time, and like also those who are running are going to be running for 16 days, super close to exam time.
Right.
And I think that, like, as someone who's run in the elections twice, I think like last time it was too short of a campaign period. The first time it was like a good amount. So I would suggest like there's lots of ways that you can allow for students to get more in more contact with the people who are campaigning. There's lots of more events that we can, I don't know if you like, even I can talk to you about like events that, you know, could generate more constituents like partaking in the elections. But I think it's really, like when I see that, I don't know who would be able to take that on while also going through exams, while also trying to run for position and then go through transition a couple, like 2 weeks later after that. It's just, it's too tight. I would say that, like, I understand the nomination period starting then, I understand the candidate cafe then and everything, but I think the campaign period and the voting period needs to be reworked, and that the voting period should end, like, it should end by March, is what I would say, because I think folks are not even going to be wanting to come to campus when they're doing their exam and stuff like that. But I'm totally also for more campaign days. I understand that, but I don't think that it's going to be as beneficial as we hope.
Thanks. So next I have Katie George Shim, and then Katie McClellan, and then Alex.
Masuma brought up a couple of points that I wanted to, so thanks for pointing those out. But I think instead of having such a long period, like that doesn't seem appealing to me. I wouldn't really want to run for that long. But having, instead of longer periods of voting, longer periods of campaigning, longer periods after the fact, but having just consistent and consistent advertisement and promotion of the positions, and like in general of what it is, so people will have that time to consider running instead of having longer periods for them to drop out, or longer periods, like I having something at the beginning earlier on rather than later, I think will solve a lot of those issues. And as a person who's seen like a lot of the elections that have been here, like I also agree you don't have to stick with the events that other elections people have, and I really encourage you not to. So, but I would say earlier timeline.
Next I have Katie McClellan, and then Alex.
Yeah, I just have a question. If the elections policy was changed, when would it be in effect?
Like the moment after council approves the new policy. Okay, I believe. Yeah, do you have a point of information on that?
Not a point of information, but like specific to her point. Can I jump in with that?
If Alex is okay with that.
I think it's 60 days between changing the election policy and the elections. You need to have 60 days or more. Yeah. You can't, or is it 90? 60? 90. 90? So that would mean that any changes that would have to happen in the elections policy would have to happen before November 27th, I think. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question.
Next I have Alex on the speaker board.
Can I like amend this?
This isn't a motion, right?
Yeah, there is no motion on the floor right now.
Okay.
So you can move a motion.
Are we, sorry, is there a motion to adopt the timeline, or is that what we end up wanting to do today?
No council member has moved for a motion to adopt the timeline, so there isn't currently one on the floor. Alex, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I just want to add on to it. So the elections policy states I have to recommend on behalf of the elections committee by November 1st on this timeline. But it didn't really specify when does it have to be approved. So it's up to you guys if you want to like kind of postpone that and just propose a motion to adopt this or like later, and we can have an exchange of information in between, and we can like I can bring the summary of like the reasons why you guys think this should be changed to the committee, and the committee can reply, and then we can work out something else. But ultimately also it doesn't really the council can even just like disregard our recommendation. So our recommendation is more in terms of like what we believe is the best, but ultimately it's you guys who decide what to do with the timeline and when should it be, should there be an election. And in terms of the elections policy from what I believe, elections policy must not be amended during the by-election period and must not be amended within 3 months prior to the general elections. So is that correct?
So November 27th is fine. If we go with that.
If we go, but the thing is, if we decide to pass the policy change, effectively that will also prevent us from having the election 90 days after that policy change. So it's both ways. And Chris, would you mind confirming that with me also?
Pardon me? 90 days.
I also confirm that with me.
What exactly are we confirming? Sorry?
So we can now have a policy change during the by-elections period or within 90 days prior to the general elections period.
Yes, that's correct.
And if we have policy change regarding to elections policy change, then that means we also can set the deadline to have elections start 90 days after that policy change.
Sorry.
So if we make amendment to the elections policy, we also cannot hold a new general election prior to 90 days after that policy has been changed. Because it applies both ways. As stated by the bylaw.
So if we change the policy, we won't be able to have a by-election?
Yeah, so.
Wait, sorry, just a second. I want to clarify that because the bylaw and policy review committee has been working on a new version of the elections policy. Is that the policy in which this language is contained? Because I'm looking through our current elections policy and bylaws, and I can't find anything like that.
No, it's in the bylaw.
So yeah, pretty sure it's in the bylaws. It's somewhere.
Yeah, it's like actions in section 9.
Oh, point of information.
Yes.
You should also know that during that AGM, there were changes to the elections policy made
Okay.
that may not be recorded.
Katie Douglas, we're gonna have a meeting after this.
Tell all.
Douglas.
Motion to defer this to committee.
You can motion to defer this to committee. I have you on the speakers list and Katie Douglas and Yasmin. Would you like your motion to take priority over that? Yeah. Okay. So do I have a seconder to refer this? Which committee?
What committee? The elections committee.
Okay. Motion to refer this to the elections committee.
Just being point of information.
Sorry, I motion to take the recommendations and suggestions so far as council to look into what type of policy we're judging this timeline on, what policies we'll be interpreting in the future, and if the policies we're interpreting are in fact correct and also updated. And I would like to motion, whereas all of those things apply to the elections committee, in which the CRO chairs.
All right, so it's a motion to refer this to the elections committee for further consideration of the feedback of council. Councilors would also have an opportunity to email the CRO if they have further questions. Does this have a second? Keith Douglas. All in favor of referring this to committee? All opposed? Any abstentions? It is referred. Okay, we will move along in the agenda then to, there's no old business. Executive business.
I move to have executive business circulated by electronic copies.
Okay, so this will be a move to amend the agenda to remove executive business. Okay, this does require unanimous consent, where we have already approved the agenda. Does it have a second? Okay, is there any opposition to removing executive business from the agenda? Sorry, who was the second? Katie McCall or Chantal?
What?
We just need a second. Is there any opposition to removing executive business from the agenda? Seeing none, let's take it on unanimous consent. Are there any notices of motion? Are there any notices of motion?
Yes.
Okay. Are there notices of motion? I genuinely do not know.
If we notice for a motion, we can table it if it's not ready, is what I'm wondering, correct? Or do we need to have the text of the motion ready now?
Oh, you do need to have the full text of the motion ready now. According to precedents that council established earlier in this meeting, it is okay to say that you want to fully repeal or replace a motion and then circulate the changes by the end of the night. But that would be subject to potentially another challenge of the chair, as we had earlier. All right, what motion?
For the commissioner policy, coming from the bylaw and policy review committee.
So is this for example, to use the structure that we have had used earlier in this meeting, be it resolved that the text of the ethical of the committee policy as it stands be replaced with the circulated text?
Yes.
Okay, so the full notice of motion is be it resolved that the text of the committee policy as it stands, commissioner policy, sorry, as it stands, be replaced with the circulated text. Do you have a current copy of the commissioner's policy?
I do, because it's sent it to you.
Please do, and I will circulate it to council by the end of the night. Are there any other notices of motion? Are there any other notices of motion? Okay.
Also the elections and referendum policy. Similarly to the bylaw and policy committee.
Okay, so the motion is be it resolved that the text of the elections and referenda policy as it stands be replaced with the circulated text. Amina is nodding. I just want to record that for the record.
And my understanding is that as long as it's submitted by the end of the night, it's by the precedents, it's fine.
Yes, as long as it is circulated by the end of the night. We have already also sent the motion in full, so we are meeting our bylaw requirements in that regard. But as a matter of procedure, it is good to circulate it all by the end of the night. Are there any other notices of motion? Are there any other notices of motion? Look at the bylaw and policy review committee. Are there any? Okay, so those two notices of motion will come up at the November 15th meeting.
Elections and referendum are separate.
Okay, I thought that was one policy. So then 3 notices of motion. 1, be resolved that the text of the commissioner policy as it stands be replaced with the circulated text. Motion 2, be it resolved that the text of the elections policy as it stands be replaced with the circulated text. Motion 3, be resolved that the text of the referenda policy as it stands, be replaced with the circulated text. All text will be circulated to councillors as soon as I receive them. If there are no other notices of motion, we'll move on to announcements. Does anybody have any announcements that they'd like to make to council?
External Action Committee's meeting on Thursday. You down to join?
I will be away starting tomorrow at 4, and I will be back until next Tuesday. And I'll have limited access to email.
I didn't approve that question. Any other announcements from council? Ashley?
DAS is having a Shake It Up 150 panel, so just on the topic of Canada 150, we're having an Indigenous speaker come in, Naomi Metallic, I don't know if you guys have heard of her. But it's in here November 14th, 5 till 7, so just on that.
Thank you, Ashley. Are there any other announcements for council? Seeing none, my only announcement is that this council will next meet on November 15th. Do I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn? Moved by Corey, seconded by Masuma. Any opposition to adjourning? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.